the whole screen?
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So not to repeat myself, the Opium War is really about three things, three commodities: tea, silver, and opium. And we will go through that. I'm taking politics out of it. I don't start with imperialism. Some of my colleagues do, but I don't. I want you to come to your own conclusion. Okay. Um, Lord Macartney and Lord Amherst, among others, were sent to China, Qing China, Qing Dynasty China. Qing Dynasty China was ruled by the Manchus, with the shaved forehead with the Q, from 1644 to 1911. So Lord Macartney was sent to China in 1793 and Lord Amherst in 1817. And why were they sent to China? The private secretary to Lord Macartney left a memoir, and this is what he said. John Barrow said in the memoir that the China trade is the most important and the most advantageous of the company's extensive concern is, I believe, universally admitted that it is worthy of high consideration in a national point of view, requires little proof. It employs directly from England 20,000 tons of shipping, nearly 3,000 seamen. It takes off our woolen manufacturers and other products to a very considerable extent, and it brings into the exchequer annual revenue of about 3 million sterling. Remember, this is 1792, 1793, late 18th century. It is the grand prop of the East India Company's credit and the only branch of their trade from which perhaps they may strictly be said to derive real profit. So it was for trade that Britain reached out to China. And who founded the long journeys? East India Company. The East India Company were working very hard to open the China market. And we move on. Why did the grand pop, by the way, is tea, the tea trade. So we traced, because the lecture is about origin, theater and consequences. Theater is the theater of war. Origin is the origin of the conflict, and so we go to the origin now. Origins in the UK, it's tea consumption. Luxury and novelty were of special significance to 18th century consumers. Even among very ordinary people, the key incentive to changing consumer and household behavior was provided by the prospect of novelties, luxuries, or new addictive goods such as sugar and tea. I didn't say this. At the end, you will see who said this. By 1760, a breakfast of toast and rolls and tea was entrenched in the middling circles, and tea drinking was a domestic event, still limited until the last half of the 18th century, mainly to the middling and upper classes, but quickly becoming a priority of expenditure among the artisan and laboring classes and even the poor. Tea and coffee were particularly associated with polite behavior. So you can see the Victorian tea sets, tea room, and the lots of advertisement about tea on tea. It's really fun to go through those advertisements to see how people, how companies advertise their products. And this is from the book Luxury and Pleasure in 18th Century England by my colleague, I think she's retired now at Warwick, Maxine Berg. She's an expert on, you should invite her to give a talk. She's very good. So this is the origin of the first Opium War in England. It's the rising demand for tea. And there is a problem with this rising demand for tea, is because as the rising demand was caused by the middling and lower classes, because they joined the consumption. Because if they didn't, maybe it was all right, because East India Company shipped certain quantities of tea, but then the joining of the middle and lower classes made it, important for them. Well, it was a great business opportunity. More people want to drink tea, and more you should export more tea from China. So the only problem at that time in the 1790s, late 18th century, was that tea could only be procured from China. So unlike today, you have black tea from India, you have African tea, Kenya and all that. But at that time, tea could only be procured from China. Um, China only accepted gold or silver for bulk um, payment for bulk commodities. When in China, we have the two metallic system. One is gold or silver. That's for bulky transaction for paying taxes. The other is copper cash, stringed together and that's when you go to the market to buy vegetables, to buy soy sauce, and so there are two systems. One is for trade, which is silver, and this is a silver ingot. We call it silver ingot. So this I don't know how to explain. It's a long story, but anyways, this is the silver ingot that's used to pay for tea for a lot of foreigners. So a lot of them, they came from Mexico, and they were melted and all that. So there's a whole story about silver. But anyways, you got the point that Britain needed more tea. Tea could only be procured from China. China only accepted silver for payment. So, and this demand for silver payment actually began in 1600s. Remember, the East India Company, British East India Company arrived. Well, the Dutch East India Company arrived in 1601 and in Asia, in Indonesia, buying tea from Chinese merchants there. And then the British East India Company arrived in 1602. So imagine Europeans were in Asia buying tea, buying silk, buying porcelain, buying spices, everything. You imagine they all have to use silver. So by the late 18th century, when Lord Macartney went to China, China was the silver coffin. China had sucked in. It's really important for us to know this. China had sucked in the world's reserve, the entire world supply of silver. And it's really interesting to study the silver at this time because they came from different places, from Burma, from Japan, from Mexico. So what happens now, by the late 18th century, that's why Lord Macartney was sent and Lord Amherst was sent, was because Britain was running out of silver. They can't find any more silver to go to China to buy more tea. So what do? So you try to find out what the Chinese would buy from you and pay with that silver. And it was not the British who discovered that. It was the Portuguese. The Portuguese discovered that actually, because when the Europeans went to Asia, went to China to buy stuff, the problem is China was not buying much from them because China didn't need to buy from them. Woolen products, you have them in North China, silk, we have our own. There's nothing that the Chinese needed from the European traders. That's the problem. So the British and the other Europeans ran out of sources of silver, and it was the Portuguese who discovered that the Chinese were actually buying a few chests of opium, and they were happy to pay with silver. And then the Dutch caught up with that. And then the last comer was the British. They arrived on the scene and by the late 18th century. So they found it hard to find more silver to buy more tea. And the Chinese, however, were buying opium with silver. And then the silver, the more opium China bought, the more silver came out of China. So you can see in 1820, China bought about 4,244 chests. I don't know whether you've been to Hong Kong. Hong Kong History Museum has a chest, this opium chest, and each chest can hold 18 balls of opium, raw opium. So it's about, like a small football. So 18 of them. So by the 1830s, that is a huge jump in supply. And by the way, this opium was carried to China not just by the British. They were Americans, they were Parsis, they were Danish, they were French, they were Prussian, East India companies. There were many other people. So I think the reason I always think that people don't invite me to talk about the Opium War because they were, worried about what. But it's not just the British. Everybody, and the Dutch was very much leading as well. And you can see by 1839, on the eve of the first Opium War, it was 40,000 chests. That's a lot of opium. That's a lot of opium. A lot of opium went into China. A lot of silver came out of China. And Jardine Matheson, I don't know whether anybody knows Jardine Matheson, anybody is related to Jardine Matheson. Jardine Matheson is a company, and the company that had the lion's share of the opium trade, they're still operating at 3 Lombard Street in London. And to write my PhD thesis, I had to get their permission to see their archives in Cambridge. They deposited their archives in Cambridge. So Jardine is of course they don't do opium anymore. They do other things, environmental, energy, green, other things. And I thought it might be interesting for the A-level students to see that Jardine has internships, apprenticeship, and in the 1980s, and they had a famous intern who later became a British Prime Minister. Maybe one of you will tell me later who this famous intern might be. Okay, so we're on origin in UK, and we go to the origin in China. It takes two to tango, and many previous scholarship don't mention this, don't mention the origin in China, and I want to highlight that. The origin of the Opium War in China is that there was rising demand for opium as the middle and lower classes joined smoking. So in a way, it's kind of a parallel story. You have tea consumption in England in the 17th century is more upper classes and then filtering down to the lower class, middling and lower classes by the 18th century. And then you have you have opium smoking, being the sort of the fashionable thing among the upper classes in the 16th and 17th century. And by the 18th, 19th century, opium smoking also filtered down classes in China. So you have two commodities. So if you will, if you're not a political historian, if you're just an economic historian, you'd say it's about two commodities. So two people wanting to consume what they don't have, and they have to get from each other. So in China, the story for opium is the same with tea. At middle classes, low classes joined smoking. Then there's large quantities of opium being imported and led to silver outflow. It also led to problems because opium is addictive. And then you have people getting addicted, and they would sell their, house, their wives, and their children because they're addicted. So, and you have people die on the street, and you have soldiers addicted, in the army. So unlike, I mean, tea is also addictive, but it's less, I suppose, destructive than opium. So in China, you can go to the brothel. This is a picture, an image I found in the Library of Congress when I was a PhD student. I had to pay for this. And this one is you can entertain friends at home. So you can go to the brothel. You have a courtesan or prostitute, helping you to set this up, and then you can do it at home. So it's like tea drinking, entertaining friends and all that. And then we can see the numbers of the silver outflow. 74 million taels of silver. That is a lot of silver from the in this 20 years, and you're going to see more. As China became addicted to opium, they bought more opium, and more silver left China, went into the hands of traders like Jardine, like the Dutch, and like other people. Um, so this, if you want to know more about why the Chinese people smoked opium, then you can read my first book, The Social Life of Opium in China. My students love it because it describes in detail how to smoke. I always ask them, what would you like about it? Rather than the real socio-economic consequences, they like the details about smoking. So we have origins in Britain and origins in China. And here are the numbers. Not compiled by me. It's a bit dated. It's compiled by Michael Greenberg, one of the greatest economic historians in the 1950s. So, but at the moment, we more or less agree. This is roughly the numbers that were exported to China or imported by China, the numbers from Bengal, from Malwa. These are the top opiums. The Turkish opium is less expensive. The reason Indian opium are more expensive is they're strong, they're potent, they're very strong, and Turkish opium is less strong. I suppose it has something to do with the soil, with the weather, with the chemical components, because every soil is different, every weather. Um, yes, there's dispute about those numbers, but largely more or less. Oh, let's put it this way. These numbers, although we dispute, but no one has challenged them yet. No one has furnished us with better statistics, so we stick with them. Okay, so we turn to the theater of war. I always call it theater because it's kind of you're watching history happening. So obviously, opium caused huge social economic problems for the Qing Empire. The emperor decided to declare war on opium, on the British. So he appointed someone, Commissioner Ling, to go to Canton at the southern tip of the Chinese mainland. And he arrived there in March 1839. And then he demanded foreign merchants to surrender their stock of opium. And the foreign merchants is like, who do you think you are? Um, and the foreign merchants is not, I keep emphasizing, they're not just British, they're from many other countries. So they lived in this row of houses on the Pearl River, at the edge. I will show you exactly where it is. So there are 13 companies that was trading opium. And Britain is only one of them. Of course, Jardine was the largest. So Commissioner Ling is his only picture, allegedly his only real picture, was a bit draconian. So he came to Canton. He surrounded this area where the foreigners lived and worked and sold opium. It in the foreign language literature, it's called 13 factories because 13 companies operated there. So he surrounded this area. He demanded the Chinese servants and translators to leave. He said, you have to leave because you're working for the enemies of the country. So he withdrew the Chinese servants, translators, then the foreigners couldn't do it. No chef, nobody cook anything, nobody washed their clothes. And then he tried to cut the supply of water and everything. Basically, he tries to confine them in that place. So that's why it's called confinement, the foreign traders. And after 2 months, from late March to almost late May, all the foreigners left because you're dying there. There's nobody there. There's armies surrounding you, and your life is more important. So of course, one by one, they all left. So what they did is they left behind the opium stock, which is, at least we agree, most of us agree, it's more than 20,000 chests. They left it behind. It's not, they didn't surrender it. It's they left it behind. And this opium was destroyed by the Chinese government, by commissioner, witnessed by missionaries. So missionaries actually left reports and memoirs about this because foreigners were wondering, what are you going to do with this opium? Because you can sell them too and make money too. So this is what we call theater, what I call theater of war, episode 1. And now, if you look at this map of southern tip of China, you can see Hong Kong is here. You can see the 13 factories is here, where the foreigners lived and worked and were confined is here. And you see Macau is here. Most of them left Canton for Macau because, they haven't had good food and clothing, and so they left. And this is Hong Kong, and this is Kowloon. So I always tell my students, ask my students, maybe I ask A-level students here, what does this map of southern tip of China, this is really the southern tip of China, tell you about warfare? Because there's so many islands, you see, because this is the end of the Pearl River, and the Pearl River estuary is full of little islands. And maybe one of the students can ask me a question. What does this tell you about warfare, naval warfare in this region? Because that's the theater of the First Opium War. Okay, we move on to the second episode. So actually, after the opium was destroyed in early June, nothing happened. Foreigners were gone, opium were burned, destroyed. It seems everything was fine, right? The emperor asked me to come here to get rid of the opium, get rid of the foreigners. I've done that. So it looked everything was fine, but everything was not fine. And of course, Commissioner Ling didn't know that. So the beginning of the war, the real fighting, was the death of a grocer, Lin Wei-shi. So what happened, if you remember this map, Kowloon is here. So at that time, Kowloon on the peninsula, Kowloon Peninsula, in the whole neighborhood, Kowloon Peninsula has a grocery store, the largest grocery store. And the people who left Canton, some went back to England to lobby for war. Some went to Macau to rest and see and watch what might happen. Some were hanging around on the sea. They're in their boats, they're drinking. So what happens is they went to Kowloon, the tip of the peninsula, where the largest grocery store, and they wanted to buy more alcohol because they were drinking. And the good Chinese grocer Ling said, "You are already drunk. I am not selling you any alcohol." So he's being kind of a fatherly figure, kind of a, you already drunk, I'm not going to sell you. And what happened after is the 6 British sailors, merchants, they beat him up. And they took alcohol anyways. I don't know whether they left money. So they beat him up and they took the alcohol. I don't know whether they took all the alcohol. So this grocer died the next day on the wounds inflicted on him. So this is the beginning of the war. But the Chinese government said, no, you should send the 6 sailors and merchants to us because the crime was committed on Chinese soil. And the leader of the British community at that time was Captain Charles Elliot. His real title was actually Superintendent of Trade. It's kind of a British ambassador like. And he didn't do that. He didn't send the 6 people. He sent the 6 people to Singapore and then they went back to England. So the first shot was fired by the Chinese coastal guards in the exchange of letters because Commissioner Ling and Captain Charles Elliot were exchanging letters about what to do with the murder, with the guy who died and the 6 sailors. So the Chinese were frustrated and fired the first shot. Anyways, that's the beginning of the Opium War, first Opium War. It got nothing to do with opium. It's the death of a grocer. So it's an issue, what we call extraterritoriality. It's an international law. And of course, at that time, China didn't, there was no, China didn't, recognize international law or anything. So the first expedition, the small battles were led by Charles Elliot. And Charles was fired by Lord Palmerston because the war dragged on into 1840, from 1839 to 1840, and he didn't procure any treaty. He didn't manage to subdue the Chinese. So the second Lord Palmerston fired him, and he was sent to Barbados or somewhere, a little island, to be governor. And then Lord Palmerston sent Henry Pottinger. Henry Pottinger, you can see the pictures. Yeah, that's the only picture I can find of Charles Elliot. And this is Henry Pottinger. Henry Pottinger has many pictures because he's the first governor of Hong Kong. So he came, he was what was described a no-nonsense man. He came and did what he was told to do. So I feel that Elliot felt he shouldn't be waging a war on the people. But anyways, Henry Pottinger did that in August 1841. He brought the Chinese to their knees, in the words of Foreign Office, and procured a treaty a year later. He became the first governor of Hong Kong. You know who should have been the first governor of Hong Kong? Is Charles. Because it was Charles who directed all the foreigners, especially the British, to go to Hong Kong rather than to Macau. And so during the war to take refuge. And since then, he began to develop Hong Kong. So this is the real theater of war, the second episode. And maybe the A-level students can take on this picture as well. What does this picture tell you about Qing Dynasty China? These are the British ships, warships, and these are the Chinese ones. I'd like your thoughts or questions about this. And this is Chinese commander on a smaller boat, and this is the bigger boat, and this is the boat that's been blown up. It's a real picture drawn by participants of the First Opium War, one of the officers. So maybe A-level students, you take a stab at this. Okay, so we had the war and the consequences. Consequences, it's the Treaty of Nanking. What historians have said, it's a piece of paper that changed China forever. It's not accurate to say that China has never signed humiliating treaties before. It's not accurate because in the Song Dynasty, when the Jurchens, when the Mongols came, they signed a lot of humiliating treaties. China had to pay tribute to them. But this is a treaty that really changed China and history because it ushered in a different era. Ushered in a different era, and if you have questions, we can discuss that later. And consequences, there's more consequences. The Treaty of Nanking imposed on China is significant because it kicked off what John King Fairbank of Harvard University coined the century of unequal treaties. Because, Britain signs a treaty with China, you think the French will sit there and say, oh, that's okay. No, French came, Americans came, Russians came, everybody came, even Portuguese and everybody, Austro-Hungarians and everybody. So that's why he called it the century of unequal treaties. Second, there are several consequences, short term, long term, medium term. So the short term is China had to pay an indemnity of 21 million taels. 21 million taels was not a lot of money, but it opened the floodgate. Like you have to pay for the war. So 5 million was for the opium destroyed. Remember, the foreigners left a lot of opium in China and they were destroyed. So they were compensated for that. And the 16 million was for naval expedition operation, British naval operation. So in the words of a Chinese historian is, we had to pay for the British to come and beat us and defeat us because you had to pay 16 million to cover the naval expenses. And China had to cede Hong Kong to Britain. That's the beginning of Hong Kong. And then 5 ports, open 5 ports to British trade and missionary work. It's missionary work is everywhere. When you make a treaty, it's always, trade and missionary work. So when you say open to British trade, I mean, it's all Europeans would come. So it's not just British trade and they would come. So these 5 ports were Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai. And we all know where Shanghai comes from because Shanghai emerged to be the leader. Shanghai kind of overpaced Canton and other places. This is short-term consequence. It led to the Second Opium War, which is an entirely different story. It's always confusing to tell First Opium War and Second Opium War, and then there will be another Opium War with the French. There's lots of Opium Wars, and we don't have time to go for that. But the consequences of this Second Opium War was legalization of the opium trade. So that's what the British wanted in the end. The midterm consequences is that, remember, China was ruled by the Manchus. And the Manchus were not exactly Chinese. They're kind of Mongols, Proto-Mongols. Mongols came from North China. The Manchus came from Northeast China. China's enemy had always been the nomads from the north. So it intensified their animosity. Chinese didn't like the Manchus anyways. Now you lost the war. You signed a humiliating treaty. You're ceding land. So it galvanized the Chinese. It quickened the Qing's decline and gave rise to Chinese nationalism. So that's midterm because the dynasty will be overthrown in 1911. So the dynasty after the Opium War had about 7-8 decades to live. And then long-term consequences is China's distrust of the West. Because it's like, especially on the issue of human rights. For a lot of Chinese people, ordinary people, not just politicians who make a great deal out of this, is you are the violators of human rights. And now you're lecturing us about human rights. So that is the common perception, distrust of the West. And in the post-Mao era, China's determination not just to catch up with Britain, with America, but to outdo them and outshine them. So which is the long. So let's just give you a picture of the short and medium term of the Opium War. You see, after the first Opium War, Britain had Hong Kong. Immediately after that, 1858, Russia annexed a huge chunk of land north of Amur River and east of Usuli River. This is 1 million square kilometers of land. Vladivostok here was a Qing city, was a Qing China Chinese city. Russia also in 1864 chipped away northern Mongolia and today's Kazakhstan from the Qing Empire. And of course, you have the French coming, the French taking southwestern China, and you have the Germans taking a chunk of North China. You have the purple is Japanese coming, taking Korea, Taiwan, and having both sides of the Straits of Taiwan as its sphere of interest. The green is British. The green is British. Green. So Britain has a huge part. Britain had huge influence in Tibet, in the Yangtze River Valley, in Canton area, and which puts them in direct conflict with the French. The purple is, this is a very accurate map about what happened after, and historians have called this the scramble for China. Everybody wants to have, in the words of the Germans, is everybody needs a place in the sun. So China was the sun. I need a place in the sun. So it's the Opium War that kicked off this, because everybody saw China was weak. China was traditional, not modern, not industrial, and they can take advantage of it. Now, I want to, because here we talk about the short term, mid-term, long term, I also want to talk about long term. And we fast forward to the post-Mao era. And China has finally caught up with Britain, with the West. And, China sells a lot of EVs, electric vehicles. And if you don't read Chinese, you wouldn't see that their generations of EV is named after Chinese dynasties. Qing is a dynasty, Han is a dynasty, Tang is a dynasty. They're very nationalistic, very proud. So if you bought a Chinese EV, if you don't know, they have a message for you. we have outshone you. And there are Chinese robots everywhere. I don't know whether you've been to China. And I had one of them. I don't mind because, they're clean. They're clean. They bring the food to you. There's no verbal any communication, which, somebody talks, oh, here's your food. It goes over. So they're very good at delivering food, cleaning up. And of course, China's high speed is absolutely amazing. If you go to China, if you go to Hong Kong, you take, from Hong Kong to Beijing, it used to be 3 days. Now it's 1 day, 8 hours. You can have breakfast in Hong Kong and dinner in Beijing. It's absolutely amazing. But also what's funny is you sit on this train, you're enjoying modernity, high tech. The screen in front of you sings praises of the Communist Party. you just like, how do you make sense of this? Long-term consequences for me is China seeks to outshine Britain and the West and dominate the world. And, China controls all the world's ports. And this is called Chinese port expansion in Africa. It controls many ports. And China is huge in Latin America in investment. They've just built a port in Chancay in Peru, going straight, bypassing Panama Canal and everything. And many of you know I don't know how we got here. Many of you know the Belt and Road Initiative, the Silk Road. You know, the Silk Road goes to Madrid. It goes to Hamburg and Rotterdam. All the goods coming from China. China is also building a railway through Burma, Myanmar, cutting the Straits of Malacca, Singapore. So because Singapore allied itself with America. So China is doing a lot of things in the world. And I just, my new book, I had a new book coming out last week. It's called Railway Imperialism in China. So in that book, I don't think the regime is going to like that book because I said, yes, China suffered in the hands of railway imperialists, but today she is an imperialist of herself. So that's the end of the talk. And I welcome questions and I welcome A-level students to engage with me. If you want to find out more, you can buy this textbook written for everybody.